oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice in the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. Long live the King, the Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. You may be seated.
Morning all. I apologize. For not hearing me. Thank you for that indulgence.
Just one matter of housekeeping this morning, Your Honor.
Yes.
There is an additional version of Mr. Angel's draft reports that we want marked as a lettered exhibit. It has been provided in hard copy to my friends and in hard copy and electronically to the court. I believe this will be exhibit GG. And I would say that this could be called Eric Angel Draft Reports Red Lines. And what it is as you'll recall, Mr. Angel produced, there are 3 draft reports in there, and this is a red line as between the April 18th and the June 8th. So that's the first red line. The second red line is between June 8th and June 22nd. And the third red line is as between June 22nd and the final.
And just for my own edification, is there a difference between red line and track changes?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I'll figure it out.
So a red line function is when you take 2 Word documents and you ask the computer, how are these different?
Oh.
And typically when a red line is run, the system first asks you, I'm going to act as if all the track changes have been accepted. But here, given the way this is done, I don't think there were any track changes. It's just a pure red line.
I'll take a look at it, and if I have questions, I'll ask you. That's okay.
Yes, fair enough. Okay, so I think, Mr. Angel, where we left off yesterday is we were moving to a new topic within part E of your slides, which is we were talking about the RST accounts in the period of 1862 to 1909, and we were specifically talking about the band-specific accounts, and you were going to start describing how those work. So if we could be on slide 38, and if Mr. Angel could tell us about slide 38, that would be great.
I have a clarification I wanted to make about something I said yesterday.
Sure.
That pertains to slide 29. If I could do that now, that would be great.
Sure. Can we return to slide 29?
I'll also be asking to look at document 4, page 3, after I finish discussing
Document
4 out of my collection.
Okay. Well,
are we able to call up a document?
Probably.
It's a very short, it's an order in council. It's very short, but it's just a much easier document to refer to, and I think it would be helpful.
But if it's document 4, I need to know how else we have described that.
Yes.
I see. Okay.
Maybe if you're going to speak first to slide 29, speak to slide 29, and then we'll talk about this document 4.
Okay.
It probably has a few names.
Okay. Yeah, that's why I was giving a heads up to that one, anticipating. Okay.
Right.
So the issue is that I said I was speaking yesterday about what investments there were that were held as part of the Indian Trust Fund between 1848, when the books open that I'm looking at, through to the end of 1860. And I said there were the debentures for individual nations, all of the debenture accounts. And apart from that, I made a reference to there being some worthless investments. So I went back to the ledger book last night and looked through it. First of all, the term worthless investments, that's from another later document. The term that they use then is unproductive investments. And what you have in the books is a series of accounts for some bonds, some mortgages, stocks, and a loan, most of which are set up as separate accounts, like the Upper Canada Bank stock is a separate account, and it lists the interest paid on that from year to year. And then also at the end of the ledger volume, there's a recapitulation, a financial statement effectively for each year. And then there's notations below that signed by the accountant for the Indian Department. And in that notation, that's where there's a reference to the Grand River Navigation Company and the Cayuga bridge stock. There's no indication at that time that they're worthless or unproductive. They're simply recorded in there as additional investments held on behalf of the Six Nations. So just to recapitulate, there's debentures that are held. And in addition to that, there's a number of other investments that are held, they're recorded on the books. And if we're not able to go to document 4, I can just explain that in that order in council, they have a schedule or a list of the investments that were assumed by the province of Canada under date January 1st. And what I've just described is listed in there, not in detail about every single investment. Some of them are rolled up into a category, but there is a good description in there. And so that's a useful document to look at, just to understand like a snapshot of where the investments sat as of January 1st, 1861.
And this order in council that you've just spoken to, do you recall what the date of it was?
January 16th, 1861.
Okay.
Oh, so this is the OIC.
Yes, yes.
And when you were reviewing these accounts, you said that in the document itself, the word unproductive is used. What does that mean?
It's not returning interest or any, there's no revenue coming from that investment
And why would that be for an investment?
because the issuer is no longer making good on their commitment to pay interest on the coupon value or whatever the case might be, or the mortgage.
Or do you know?
Oh, in specific cases, yeah, the holder
No,
of the,
no, the question was, why would there be no interest being paid? It's a general question. Do you know?
yes,
Okay. Sorry, I thought you were giving a
hypothetical.
conceptual answer.
No, so why?
Because the people who held the mortgages weren't able to pay. They weren't making payments on them.
I think unless the court wishes to look at the order in council, I might move on.
That would be fine with me. There's just one thing, if I could ask. In your clarification, you said, yesterday I spoke of worthless investments, but they were called unproductive investments. Is that in the OIC?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And perhaps just for the court's ease of reference, I believe my friend Ms. Lewis knows the number.
Yes.
4912 of Exhibit 1.
Yes.
So just in case the court wants to find it, it's Exhibit 1-4912.
Thank you.
In the joint book of documents.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lewis. Was there anything else you wanted to speak to before we return to slide 38?
No.
Okay, so let's get ourselves back to slide 38. And then I'll just ask you to speak to that slide.
Can we go back one slide just so I can be sure of the time period we're talking about here?
For sure. Slide 37.
Okay, fine. So you can go back to.
Okay, so
slide
let's go to
38.
slide 38.
Thank
And
you.
this slide at a high level, I think, discusses the monies that are flowing into and out of the band specific principal sub accounts. So please go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, yes, the time period here is from 1862 to 1909. These are the band specific accounts. Within the principal sub account, you've got primarily revenues from land and timber sales. Then out of those principal sub accounts, the band specific ones, you've got expenditures that are primarily on what we would think of as capital expenditures. So building of roads, bridges, school buildings, surveys of land, maybe prior to sale. There's no monies within these accounts that belong to individuals. That's all I have to say on that slide.
So did all Robinson Superior Treaty First Nations have one of these accounts?
Not initially. They were opened up from time to time. There's a table in my report, I don't recall the number, which lists the year and the date at which each of these accounts was opened for the different First Nations. If I remember right, the only two,
Would you mind going to your report
oh, certainly,
and telling us where that is?
certainly, of course. There it is. Page 20, table 3. And page 21. So the report extends over 2 pages.
Maybe if we, yeah, that's great. So could you just sort of briefly describe what the table shows?
Of course. So the first column had a date opened. That's the first date in the accounting record, so in the ledger. So the ledger might, have started earlier, but that's the first entry in the account. So I consider the account to have been opened, for instance, for Mishpakoten as of February 20th, 1856. The next column is the name of the account. I'm being literal here. I'm taking the name that is recorded in the ledger book, so it may not be the same as the present day First Nation. The type of account, again, that's the account that existed at the time. So the one that's prior to 1860, which is the Mishpakoten account, that's a land fund. The rest of them have the principal and interest, and then the capital and interest sub-accounts that I've talked about. And then finally, that's an archival reference. So Library and Archives Canada, RG10 is Record Group 10, Indian Affairs, and so on. So I looked through this last night. I realized that I still sometimes forget that we're dealing only with the Robinson Superior. Most of this table is both treaty areas. So I looked through it, and the only 2 nations I saw here that are within the Robinson Superior area are Mishpakoten, the first one, and then Fort William, which looks like it'll be on the next page.
You could go to the next page. I believe it's the second row on page 21 of your report.
Yes, so yeah, all the other nations look to me to be Robinson Huron nations. So these aren't all of the nations obviously covered by the Robinson Superior Treaty. These are just the accounts that happen to be open as of this time period I'm looking at.
And what's the end of the time period?
1909.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there's no index at this time that you can look at. You just have to go through the ledger book page by page and look through all the accounts until you find them.
And could you remind us what kind of event would cause a band-specific account to be opened? I know it differed in case to case, but.
Sure, it would be some sort of transaction that generated revenues that would flow to the band. So the sale of land or a timber surrender or another surrender for sale, I suppose. But yeah, those 2 are the main categories.
And maybe you covered this, but does this table reveal that there were no other RST nations with band-specific trust fund accounts in this period?
It does then.
And the opening of a ledger is triggered by an event, and you say, and the event is the generation of revenue.
Correct.
So on slide 38, you talked about monies flowing out of these band-specific principal sub-accounts. The monies flowing out, was that when capital was drawn down?
Yes,
Because we're talking about the principal sub-accounts here, so are these capital amounts?
yes, they are.
And in some cases, did the First Nations themselves request that the capital be drawn down?
I can't speak to specific instances here. I know, if I'm allowed to say this, I've looked at many series of correspondence that relate a First Nation to its accounts, and I've seen many First Nations where there is correspondence where they request certain activities or transactions to happen, or they give their approval for them. But I did not look at any accounts for the Robinson Superior Treaty Nations in this time period, so I don't know if they specifically requested or agreed to or anything.
So what you know is the capital was drawn down and you're not sure why.
Well, I know why. It's because of those expenditures, but I don't know what the authority or
Oh, I see.
I don't know the circumstances.
And is it your conclusion that they were for capital expenditures?
It follows from the account that they're in. So that is a capital account. So any expenditure. within
Oh,
that-
so by virtue of it coming from a capital account, you call it a capital expense?
Correct. And
Okay.
it is not at all cut and dried. Unfortunately, there is a lot of bleed through between what is considered capital and interest. And it is an issue that has generated a great deal of correspondence within Indian Affairs right up to the end of the 20th century. I've read memos and documents discussing what the proper distinction is. So it's,
So those, what you're saying is those people who made the ledger entries,
mhm,
they or someone determined whether it was an appropriate expenditure out of the capital account.
right.
You're not taking any
Oh, no. Oh, no.
position on this.
No, absolutely not.
And you say that the documents reveal that there was some controversy from time to time on whether something was a capital expense.
Not documents that I've included with this, except for the band management, the manual of, I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact title of it, but it's a 2009 document from Indian Affairs. It's a manual for the management of band monies or something along those lines. It doesn't speak of controversy. A document like that would never do that, but it does talk about the distinction between capital and revenue expenditures. But there, and the Joan Holmes report is also part of the document.
Mr.
collection.
Intros, is the document you're referring to in your sources consulted, the second line, that's Appendix E of your report. It says, well, there's a document that's entitled or described by you as so this is the author of the document and then the name, Indian and Northern Affairs Canada, 2009, Manual for the Administration of Band Monies.
That's correct.
And sorry, what does that document?
So that document gives instructions as of 2009 on the distinction between expenditures and out of the capital account versus revenue account. There's another document, I think, that's part of the collection, which is a report by Joan Holmes and Associates. And in that report, there is a discussion around the discussions within Indian Affairs about the distinction between capital and revenue expenditures. So,
And just for everyone's information, in Appendix E of your report, the third entry of sources consulted, I'll just read it. Joan Holmes Associates, Inc., 2009, the management of Indian trust funds. Is
Right.
that the document you're referring to?
it is. So it sounds like it's not part of the document collection as such. It's just in the sources consulted. Okay.
So we're looking at the first two items on page 95 of the report.
I think it's the second and third item.
Oops, that's right. That's what I should have said. Thank you.
Yeah. And if we return to slide 38 on the screen.
Go ahead.
And just to speak again to the third bullet on slide 38, could individual members of the RST First Nations deposit or keep their own money in the band-specific principal sub-account? Or have you seen records of that, I
Yeah,
guess?
I haven't seen any records that disclose that practice. No.
Go ahead.
Okay, so let's move on to slide 39, and I hear you're talking about bands. So this is the other half of the band-specific accounts. These are the band-specific interest sub-accounts. Can you please speak to how money flowed into and out of them and other things covered by this slide, please?
Sure. So the monies that flowed into the band-specific interest sub-accounts, there was interest that came out of the principal account. So if a First Nation had a large balance in their principal account, $20,000, $50,000, there's 5% or 4% interest on that. It generates a fair bit of income, and that gets deposited into the interest sub-account. So it's a source. So these are investments on their behalf that are generating income that they're then able to spend. So I think I said yesterday that that interest on the balances in the capital or principal account doesn't get reinvested in that account. So it's not compounding in there. It's used as a source of regular income, and it goes into the interest sub-account. Alongside that, you have rents or fees, fines, and refunds. Refunds, maybe there was a transaction where somebody purchased something and then they reverse the transaction and there's a refund. So
Sorry, before you go on, is there also in the band-specific interest sub-account, is some of the money coming in also interest on amounts in that account itself?
thank you. Yes, that's correct. So the balances in the interest sub-account itself also attracted interest?
And you said that yesterday as well.
I did.
Thank
yeah.
you.
Now, just to make sure that the fuller context of this is clear, for nations outside of the Robinson Superior Treaty, where they were recipients of annuities, so Mississaugas of the Credit or any number of nations, those annuities would also be a source of income in this account?
In which account?
In this interest sub-account, sorry. Like in general, the interest sub-account also received flows of annuities,
Oh,
but not for the Robinson Superior Nations because they had a treaty-wide annuity account, but for other nations. I just wanted to be clear what the larger context is of the Indian trust account system, how it operated, because the interest sub-account is the account that the nation's leadership is going to use to manage its day-to-day needs. So the relief expenditures, healthcare expenditures, salaries for band officials and so on. So it's it's the main account that's used by a community to manage its financial affairs. And so while the Robinson Superior Nations didn't have annuities going into their band-specific accounts, other nations would. I'm offering no comment on why that is or whether the two were completely distinct,
but
regimes.
But what you're saying is the interest sub-account was can I call it the checking account?
I would find that a very simple and useful analogy.
And the principal sub-account was like the savings account?
That's how I think of it.
And so the interest sub-account was used by the community, you say, to manage their affairs or to meet their daily needs. And from time to time, it had a balance that also attracted interest
Correct.
or interest accrued on balances.
Correct.
Go ahead.
Did the Crown have the last say on whether money was spent out of the band-specific interest sub-account?
Yes, technically, the Crown would have the final say. They would.
Do you know of any circumstances where a First Nations community wished to expend money out of their band-specific interest sub-account and the Crown said no?
Oh, I've seen that in the records, but I don't have any specific examples to give for this, for my testimony here.
Okay, and when, in these last couple of questions, when I've spoken of the Crown, could you tell us which emanation of the Crown was exercising this oversight?
That would be the Government of Canada.
And before Confederation?
Before Confederation would be the Province of Canada.
So I think you were going to speak to the second bullet on slide 39.
Okay. The interest rates that we're discussing, those are earned at the, I use the phrase here, band trust account rates. I picked that up from council. That was a term that that was used. It's not one that I would typically use. I just put it in here, but I normally think of the Indian trust account rates. It's just minor, but I'm just clarifying that. These
Sorry,
are-
the distinction is band trust account rates and Indian trust fund account rates.
Correct.
You say they mean the same thing?
Yes.
And you picked up what term?
Through just,
But it's okay where you
Yeah.
picked it up, but
Yeah.
you picked it up in your report. Do you use both or either?
no, I never use, I don't believe I ever use band trust account as a rate in my report. I don't think so.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So these rates are set by order in council. The first order in council is one from the province of Canada. It's, I believe, September 25th, 1861. Subsequent to that, the rates are set by federal order in council. I don't remember all the dates off the top of my head, but the main changes, oh, I discussed them later at slide 43. So I can just leave it at that.
Did the Ontario Crown ever set the band trust account interest rates?
No, Ontario did not.
Ontario, the province,
Ontario, the province. Correct.
post Confederation.
Correct.
Thank you.
Ontario, I don't believe existed before Confederation.
Well,
Well,
some people call it the United Province.
yes, I don't know that point
That's
has been
Ontario plus
established.
Quebec.
Right.
And then-
I just for me to be clear. Thank you. Go ahead.
So talk about the monies flowing out of these band-specific interest sub-accounts.
So there's quite a wide range of expenses that come out of the band-specific interest sub-accounts. I've listed some of them there by way of example. The list that I've given, so I've got distributions to band members. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Relief payments, healthcare expenses, agricultural supplies, band administration expenses, contributions to the land management fund. That list is by no means exhaustive. There's a good deal more than that. I list a few more of them in the report. In one of the tables, I'll get a number on that.
Sorry, what slide are you on?
I'm on slide 39.
Oh, still, okay.
Yeah. So if you look at page
Bullet
23.
3.
Pardon me?
So I was just saying, you were reading from bullet 3 on page.
Bullet 3, correct. Yeah.
Got it.
Page 26, table 5, that's the Batchewana Trust Fund account number 1. And I just give examples of expenditures from that account. So I looked at all of the accounts, but this is just an example of what's coming out of the Batchewana account. I'm sorry, this is a Robinson Huron Nation, but just so happened this is the one I looked at. So I want to
Oh,
explain a
sorry.
bit.
Sorry, before you go on, would you say that the flows of money in and out of the Batchewana band-specific interest sub-account is sort of broadly speaking representative of the flows of monies ins and out of the other First Nations band-specific
Yeah,
interest
it's
sub-accounts?
it's a difficult question to answer because each First Nation has its own unique set of circumstances. In very general terms, yes, it is representative, but I was going to make this point later when we talk about the table where I have the record of distributions, but I might as well make it now, which is that historians are sometimes faulted for being too hung up on the uniqueness of whatever it is that they study, and they're loath to generalize. In this particular case, when you're talking about the management of band monies and the relationship between the Crown and bands, the generalizations you can make at a very broad level are that nations had very little discretion. But that's only moderately helpful because you need to look at the circumstances of each individual First Nation over time to understand the real degree of discretion that was exercised. And it relates very much to the personality of the Indian agent at the time. If there's an Indian agent who is sympathetic to the chief and council, they work well together, there can be a great deal of discretion, and First Nations can pursue what we would think of today as an economic development strategy with the cooperation and support of the Indian agent in the department. But in other cases, you can have an Indian agent who is very controlling, or perhaps who defers constantly to headquarters decisions. And it really does vary a great deal from nation to nation around this treaty area. You'll see a lot of variation, and that variation is reflected then in the accounts. So even these are dry accounting documents, there's a story behind them that reflects what I'm talking about, relationships between chief and council, agents, and other people in the bureaucratic chain of command there. So I know the question was a simple one, or is this representative? And the answer is, at a very general level, yes, it is. But if you really want to understand what's happening in these accounts, you have to look at each one individually. Now, I want to talk about the distributions because they're quite critical because,
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Before you move on from that, you've talked about the discretion, how it can change depending on
Sure.
the Indian agent that a First Nation is dealing with. And these Indian agents, are they all federal Crown officials?
that's correct.
And so for a specific First Nation, could the discretion also vary for that First Nation over time, depending just on its own sort of band leadership and, right? Like, it's not just that certain nations had discretion and other nations didn't. Is it more like there was just a lot of variation in general?
There's
Depending on
variation.
how leading you want to be, we could.
I don't know where you're going with this, so I'm not being being led, but I will say that yes, the variation is variation over time and space. So it's
If it's personality driven, it's personality.
well,
driven.
no, but it's also the regime too. Like the Indian affairs becomes more controlling over a period of time, and there's less discretion, and then it opens up again. So
So it was in waves.
yeah, it's in waves, if you will. Yeah. But in the 1830s, there's a civilization program. I'm not going to go on about this long, but I think it's useful to make the point. In the 1830s, governments and nations come together with in many cases, a shared vision of what a prosperous future might look like. And there's a lot of interactions between Crown officials and nations where they try to use the common set of funds that they have available to them to make this kind of progress. They recognize that people are coming into the country who are going to be displacing these communities, and they need to transition into a different economic regime. And both parties are, in many respects, in agreement on that. By the time you get to the 1850s, a lot of the communities in what we now think of as Southern Ontario are being seen by the government and by settlers as impediments to progress. They're not held in the same respect, and you don't have that degree of cooperation between them. As you move into the post-Confederation era, you have a federal government that is increasingly extremely authoritarian. They pass legislation that outlaws traditional forms of governance, that stops people from practicing agriculture. It's a very oppressive regime, and that is also seen in the way Indian monies are managed. And so your discretion tends to decline over that period, except there are pockets where you have a sympathetic Indian agent. I can think of one in Treaty 3 who was there for a good long period of time, who got along very well with chief and council from the different nations. And so in those cases, there was still that shared understanding of, okay, we've got these resources, financial and otherwise, what can we do with them for the good of the community? Move forward in time, you know, there are increasing restrictions that come through the Indian Act amendments and then through the chain of command. In 1951, there's an opening up. There's some discretion that's now officially permitted nations to manage their revenue accounts. So that's the same thing as the interest sub-account. And you know, I won't take the story past there. I've already gone well past 1909, but I'm just trying to make the point that it's not some random kind of change from one year to the next. These are very much tied to the broader historical arc of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown. I didn't mean to go on quite so long.
So you were going to speak to, I think you were going to speak about distributions to band members.
Mhm. Distributions are really critical. They are a practice that dates back to at least the 1830s and possibly earlier. In a sense, they date back even earlier. But for all intents and purposes, the Robinson nations would, that's speculation. I don't want to do that. These distributions were a very important feature of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown, because they were regular, they were depended on, and if they weren't regular, they would cause crises within communities. And you have distributions that consist of annuities, and I'm talking about non-Robinson Superior Treaty nations here. And then you have interest distributions that are from the interest that flowed out of the principal sub-account into the interest sub-account. And their communities, individuals within these communities often rely heavily on these distributions as a source of income. So you will see communities where the capital has been drawn down for some reason or another.
You see, are all of these comments about non-RST nations?
They're about both. I've done a
Oh.
lot of work on both Mishpikoten and Fort William, and I'm familiar with their trust accounts. So-
Okay, so what you're saying now is with respect to RST nations?
And other nations.
Okay,
It would
thank you.
apply, yeah. So,
Go on.
go ahead. So I've seen instances where the principal or the monies in the capital account are drawn down for some reason. They're used to build a road or a new schoolhouse or something like that. As a result, the interest payments that flow out of the principal sub-account into the interest sub-account are reduced considerably. And you will see correspondence then from Indian agents to headquarters saying I'm getting complaints from chief and council. The interest rate distributions have declined and people are suffering for it. There's also a tension. It's very important to understand there's always a tension between what expenses are going to be covered for by band funds and what expenses will be covered for by Indian Affairs funds. And the departmental officials right from the 1830s onward are looking for opportunities to defray expenses out of band funds if possible. So, and this record changes over time, and I'm not going to make generalizations, but for instance, in the 1830s, band funds are being used to pay for all manner of expenses that the department thought were appropriate, or that the nations and the department were agreed on. Later on, you might see expenses charged to a band specific interest sub-account that chief and council really weren't hadn't overseen. The department was making this decision. So there's a lot of interplay there where understanding whether are these expenses really things that the band council approved, or are they really something that serves the aims of the departmental administration.
Oh, sorry. You
No,
done?
no, I was just looking at the land management fund and whether I should say anything about that, but I've
So
said enough.
I'm just going to ask you a question about something that you just spoke to. You said, and I'm paraphrasing here, distributions to band members were an important part of the relationship between First Nations and the Crown.
correct.
Which Crown were you referring to?
The federal crown, government of Canada,
And before Confederation?
before Confederation, the province of Canada.
And just so that it's clear for us all, these distributions to band members that you're talking about here, are these annuity payments?
They could include that, yes.
And are with respect to the Robinson Superior Treaty Nations, are they annuity payments?
No, they are not.
Oh, can I just ask you to hold on for a minute so I can catch up?
Yeah, sorry.
So your last question, Mr. Lipton, was with respect to the RST First Nations, are these distributions the annuities? And the answer is no.
And so the obvious follow-up question, how are they different from annuity payments?
These monies are interest that's paid on the balance in the principal subaccount or interest on the balance in the interest subaccount, the checking account.
Okay, so, and then we've heard about this before, although with respect to different accounts, your last point on slide 39?
Yes, no monies belonging to individuals from the First Nations were invested in these accounts.
And you used the word possibly because I suggested it, but you say they're from the checking account. So the distributions amongst the RST First Nations are not from, that you have been speaking about, are not from annuities. They're from the interest subaccount.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's go to slide 40 because this is actually more about these distributions.
Right.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I went back and looked at this because I want to be very careful about any statements I make about this, and realizing that we're only talking about 2 Robinson Superior Nations in my table, Mishpakoten and Fort William. I don't want to make these generalizations on the basis of just those 2 nations. I don't think it's appropriate. So I don't think you should consider what I've stated here as applying to the Robinson Superior Nations.
So how would you reword your text on slide 40, for instance? On bullet 1, would you take out the word typically and you can say from what I have seen in Fort William and Batchewana?
I could say that, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Fort William, I believe in Mishpakoten.
Oh, sorry. And
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Mishpakoten.
My apologies. Yeah. Let's look at that table. For bullet point 2, I think the best thing to do is just to look at the table I prepared. It's not a lot of information, so it doesn't take that long to go through it.
Sure, let's find that.
Just trying to find that. It's at page 88, table D3.
Okay. So what would you like to tell us about table D3?
So the second row for Fort William These are snapshots. I'm looking at it every 10 years. So in 1867, 1868, 10 years after that, following 10 years and so on. So these are 5 snapshots in time from the Fort William account. The account isn't open in 1867, 1868, so it's there in 1877, 78. All I'm providing there is the opening balance and the closing balance, so I'm not capturing the activity there. But, you know, obviously the amount has come down, and there was a distribution. What I say is one distribution, March 30th, 1878, of all available funds in the interest sub-account, $179.65. So clearly looking at the opening balance, the closing balance, and the distribution, there must have been some other money coming into the account. And then all of it flowed out to the community. And that was a decision that the community members would very much be part of making it typically, and I don't mind saying that, typically distributions are a decision between the community and the agent. So we go then 10 years later, the column headed 1887, 1888. So there's an opening balance deficit of $494.09.
When you say deficit, do you mean that the amount in the account is negative?
Correct. I was going to say that.
Okay,
Yes. So
sorry.
they're overdrawn, and there's a closing balance, a deficit of $811.67. So there were quite a few accounts in this time period that became overdrawn. And what ended up happening is the amounts got taken out of the principal, and there was a lot of, to use a colloquial word, there was a lot of angst within government over the fact that checking accounts were being overdrawn, and then they were being made good by pulling money out of the savings or principal sub-account. And that caused a fair bit of concern within government, and they started tightening up the management of those interest accounts so that they wouldn't fall into a deficit position as likely.
Do you know why in this time period the accounts might have been overdrawn?
I can't speak of it, or speak to it with any certainty. I've looked at that question before, and at one time I did have a pretty good idea, but I don't recall anymore.
Okay, fair enough. So please,
Can I just ask, in every case, if there's a deficit, was it made up by a transfer from the principal sub-account?
I haven't looked at every case like that, but every one that I've seen, yes, it's made up from the principal account.
Thank you.
So if we, I'll wait.
Go ahead, please.
Okay. If we move to the next column, 1897, 98, it says opening balance of $70.23. And then closing balance, a deficit of 468. There's income from government interest of $303.40 plus a transfer of $120 from the capital sub-account to cover the cost of fencing school grounds, no distributions. So in both those instances, sorry, the previous 10 years and then this one, there's no distributions, which is going to cause community hardship with, at Fort William. You get
Sorry, what years are those? No,
those are 1887, 1888, and then 1897, 1898. There's no distributions in those years. And then in 1907, 1908, we've got a much larger opening balance of 979.72, a closing balance of 944.81. There's considerable income from government interest of $3,643.72, plus income of $306.81 from other sources. Not surprisingly, you see two substantial distributions, 1,500 on April 12th, 1907, and 1,500 on October 10th, 1908. I'm just going by memory here, but there was a significant land surrender associated with the Fort William Reserve in this time period that most likely created was the reason why there was a big increase in interest, because that would reflect a large deposit into the principal sub-account. I'm just speculating here, but I did work on the Fort William surrenders, so I remember there was one around this time.
Okay, maybe we should go through Mitch Makoden as well, since that's the other
Sure.
Robinson Superior Tree First Nation. I believe it's split over 2 pages. It's partially on page 92 of your report, and it's also on page 93. Maybe let's just go through that in the same way, just so that we're being precise about what was happening in the RST.
Okay. So,
Oh, sorry.
my apologies.
Thank you.
The first column for 1867-68, Mishpacoton did have an account then. So they have an opening balance of $14.03. If you can flip to the next page, we'll have to go back and forth a lot, I'm afraid.
Okay, sorry.
Closing balance is $69.77, no distributions during the year. We go ahead 10 years to 1877, 1878, go back 1 page. Opening balance of 1368, and then go ahead 1 page. Closing balance, yes, of course. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, closing balance of
Oh,
thir-
$13
Yeah, I
and
was-
68 cents.
67 cents, yeah.
Okay, and the first number was,
You'll have to go back 1 page.
sorry, if you could go back 1 page.
$13.68.
Okay, sorry, and then the closing balance.
Yeah. Closing balance is $13.67. One distribution on March 30th, 1878 of all available funds in the interest subaccount, which amounted to $54.69. If we go to the back 1 page to the 10 years later, 1887 to 1888, the opening balance is $10.65. The closing balance, next page, is $10.67. There's income from government interest. So when I say government interest, that means the interest on the amount that's in the principal subaccount for this First Nation. It's not some other, form of interest. It's just, and from the interest on the balance in this account as well, the interest subaccount. So those 2 First Nations accounts there, subaccounts, the interest on those balances. There's one distribution on May 16th, 1888, of $33.98, which put the interest subaccount deficit into a deficit of $2.94. So you asked me whether I knew why these were going into deficit. One of the reasons is that a lot of these communities are heavily impoverished and they rely on the distributions as essential payments. They rely on them literally for, survival at times. So, and I spoke of when you might have a sympathetic Indian agent. So in some cases, an Indian agent is concerned about the impact that constrained income flows will have on the community, and they'll allow it to go into deficit in order for a distribution to be made. I'm not saying I'm not going to generalize about that practice. I most definitely have seen it. And I would speculate that in this instance, that's probably what was happening. But I would have to go back to the records to confirm that.
Or you'd have to go back to the record to give a specific example,
Correct. Yeah,
but you say you have seen.
I have, yes.
And what you have seen is this, what I'm understanding, a sympathetic Indian agent allows the account to go into a deficit.
Correct. Yeah. It's not the only reason that would happen, but it's one.
And does that result in the capital account amount being drawn down?
It would once the deficit is made up.
Okay. All right. So I think we've gone through most of these. Okay, so let's return to slide 40. So what you're saying is that the statements on this slide with you, sorry, earlier in your exchange with the court, you clarified the scope of your statements on the slide.
That's right. These statements were made in light of all of the nations in the two Robinson Treaty areas. And since the vast majority of the nations I looked at were from the Robinson Huron Treaty, I don't feel that these generalizations are appropriate with respect to the Robinson Superior Treaty.
Okay, are they accurate with respect to Fort William and Michipicoten?
They are.
And this is with respect to your statements on slide 40.
Correct.
And I guess just so that we have them on the record, I don't recall if you made them, could you just go through the first two bullets to describe what those statements are that you've now qualified have a certain scope?
Certainly. In the first bullet, I'll rephrase that to say that the Fort William and Michipicoten nations expended most of the income that they received as government interest in the year that it was received, based on the records that I looked at, which was a series of snapshots in time, 5 different points in time between 1862 and 1909, or 1867. 1909. In general, I state large sums of money did not accumulate in band-specific interest sub-accounts, thinking specifically of Fort William and Michipicoten, large sums of money did not accumulate. Looking at those records that I've captured in the table D3. I found no evidence of any individuals from these nations depositing their annuity payments in these band-specific accounts.
Did you find any evidence of them depositing any other funds in these band-specific accounts?
No, I did not.
Okay, so let's move on to slide 41.
So I've changed topic.
Oh, and
here.
sorry, this is part F and it's a new subject
Right.
that you're covering in your slides.
Yeah.
Interest. Sorry, please go ahead.
Okay, so what I've done here is just set out what the various interest rates were over time. These are all captured in the table 6 in my report, which extends over 2 pages. And once again, I apologize. A lot of the most important information is in footnotes.
A historian's favorite.
I know, we're guilty of it. I agree. Yeah,
It's only the font I care about.
yeah. No, it's a very good point. It's true. I'll find that table 6. It's at page 31 of my, 32 of my report and 33.
Okay, so tell if we could get those pages up on the screen. And then once we all have it, I'll have Mr. Angel tell us what it is about.
Mhm. I can just work from the slide.
Sure, okay.
So we've already discussed the debenture accounts in some detail. The 2 interest rates there were 5% and 6%. That's something else. Remember I spoke about, I wasn't totally certain what the distribution was of 5% versus 6%. If you look at that January 16th, 1861 order in council that I was talking about earlier, that gives the exact amount that's at 5% versus 6%. So you can get that there.
Okay, great. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Okay. So the cash balances, the account balances in the land fund and the annuity fund accounts in the 1850s, this is really up to December 31, 1860. They earned between 2.5% and 3% bank interest. And these cash balances were not credited to bands. The interest on these cash balances was not credited to band-specific accounts. So in other words, you know how later we were talking about how the interest on a Fort Williams band specific account. That interest went to the band. Back in the 1850s, that interest wouldn't have gone to the band. It went to something called the general account, which was a general account that the Indian Department maintained for its own purposes, and it was used to defer the costs of administration of the department. So it paid for postage and legal fees and salaries and for clerks and stuff like that. So,
And which Robinson Superior Treaty First Nations in this time period of April 1st, 1849 to December 31st, 1860 had one of these accounts?
Mishpakoten,
Was it only Mishpakoten First
only,
Nation?
only
Okay.
Mishpakoten.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's fine. So the way I was able to determine this, there's two sets of records that I used for this. The ledgers that I speak about all the time, there's recapitulations at the very end of the ledger. They're like income statements for each year. And in those, there's notations that allow you to see that the interest from the bank. So the federal government is keeping the actual cash in bank accounts. They're keeping it in the Bank of Upper Canada, Bank
Sorry,
of Hamilton.
you said the federal government?
Sorry, the province of Canada, sorry,
Okay.
apologies. Is keeping these funds, the actual cash that they hold is in chartered banks in the province of Canada. And those banks pay interest. And so what I found was a series of bank books that list all the transactions and then the interest rates. And so I went through all of those books and I found the interest rates varied between 2.5% and 3%. And then you also see that in those recapitulation statements I mentioned. They show that that interest that was received on those balances then gets transferred into the general account. So
Um,
there's no compounding that's occurring there as well.
All right, so let's go to slide 42. Can you please tell us about slide 42?
Sure. So I spoke yesterday about a transition period in the organization of the accounts from January 1st of 1861 to June 30th of 1862. And I wasn't able to determine the interest rate on the cash balances in the land fund account for a 6-month period from January 1st, 1861 to June 30th, 1861. And then within the annuity fund accounts for a year, 18-month period from January 1st, 1861 to June 30th, 1862. Likewise, I wasn't able to determine what interest rate was used on cash balances, if any.
So just with respect where you're describing the annuity fund accounts, did any Robinson Superior Treaty First Nation have an annuity fund account in this time period?
No, they did not.
Okay, and sorry,
Yeah,
please continue for the third the third bullet.
So with respect to bullets 1 and 2, these don't, is it possible to use words? These aren't relevant to the RST First Nations?
No,
first
sorry,
one
so I
is.
think there's a distinction between the second bullet and the first bullet.
right.
The first bullet,
The first bullet is relevant because that's Mishpakoten as a land fund account.
yes.
So we don't know what the interest rate was on Mishpakoten's land fund account for a 6-month period between January 1st, 61 and June 30th, 1861.
Thank you.
Then from January 1st, 1861 to, as far as I know, the present day, investments that were assumed by the province of Canada and then taken over by the government of Canada after Confederation were credited with interest at 6% as set by order in council. That order in council that set that rate was, I believe, September 25th, 1861. I should check my table and I'll see if I can confirm that. I should be able to.
So the second bullet is not
Not relevant to,
relevant to an RST First Nation.
that's correct. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
I had the date wrong. So the order in council that set the interest rate at 6% is September 24th, 1861.
And that was made by the province of Canada Executive Council.
Correct.
Okay, so let's move on to slide 43. Now, just before you start on slide 43, all throughout the slide, you say as set by OIC. What does OIC mean?
Order in council?
And for each of these cases, can you just tell us before you start, so it doesn't otherwise interrupt your narrative, which government made the OICs you're describing here?
Sure. Just give me one moment, please. I just want to look at something here. So the first bullet here, this is a bit of an ambiguous area, so I'm sorry, I'll try and explain it as clearly as possible. So the interest on balances in the principal or capital account and the interest in annuity or interest sub-accounts between July 1st, 1862 and December 31st, 1882 was 5%. As far as I know, that rate was not confirmed by a federal government OIC, Order in Council, after July 1st, 1867. I think they inherited the rate that had already been set by provincial Order in Council,
When you say provincial, you mean,
province of Canada.
okay,
They inherited that rate or just kept it in place afterwards.
okay.
And I'm blanking on which Order in Council set that 5% rate. It's one of the ones that I've discussed in my report, but it's not the September 24th, it's an earlier one. So the 5% rate is set by a provincial Order in Council. After Confederation, it continues to be the rate. I looked for a federal Order in Council that confirmed that rate and I couldn't find anything. I looked at some sources that refer to these rates, and the reason I looked for a federal Order in Council is there were suggestions in some of the secondary sources I looked at that suggested there was a federal Order in Council, but I couldn't find anything. So I think they just adopted that rate. And I'm fairly certain there's a provision in the BNA Act that says things that are as they are as of June 30th, 1867, unless otherwise specified, it continues on or something like.
We'll leave
Yeah, I
that
know, that's not
conversation
my
to the
part.
lawyers.
Anyway, okay. All right, so
Could involve Latin.
it involves that. Okay. So we have a 5% rate that goes to December 31st, 1882. Then we have an Order in Council in 1883. I didn't put the dates of the Order in Council and councils in here, but there's a federal Order in Council. It would have been, late 1882 or early 1883 that reduces the rate from 5% to 4%, and that holds true until June 30th, 1892. Then there's another change taking effect July 1st, 1892, going through to December 31st, 1897. The rate on both the capital and interest sub-accounts, this is across the board for the Indian Trust Fund accounts, is reduced to 3.5%. I'll clarify here that these are the rates where there isn't already another rate that's been set. So for instance, the capitalized amount of the Robinson Superior annuities of 40,000, we already know that attracts a rate of 5%. So this doesn't change that. This just changes the rate for any new balances in those accounts. So if for some reason you deposited some more money into the treaty-wide Robinson Superior sub-account, I would think then that the rate that applied would be this rate here. I
This
This
think
rate being,
whatever it is, as it's set out here. So between 1862 and 1882, it would be 5%. Between 83 and 92, my apologies. Between 1883 and 1892, it would be 4%.
And these rates are described in slide 43 of your demonstratives and page 33 of your report.
Correct.
32, 33 of your report.
Correct.
could I see if you, if you would agree that I put it this way, that deposits made within the periods that you have described on slide 43 attract an interest rate that applied during that period. But deposits made prior to the period attracted an interest rate of the period in which they were made.
The first sentence was correct. I agree. The second sentence. Not necessarily, because you could have a deposit prior to this period and that money stays in the account. And the interest rate will change on it.
Okay, let's try this. Let's name these periods 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Sure.
So a deposit made in period 1 accrues interest at the rate of 5%.
Correct.
A deposit made in period 2 accrues interest at the rate of 4%.
Correct.
A deposit made in period 1 that continues to accrue interest in period 2 accrues interest at what rate?
4%.
At the period 2 rate.
Correct.
So the rate of interest goes down from 5% to 4% to 3%.
It does, except where you have deposits that have a specific rate associated with them. So the capitalized amount from 1869
Yes.
has a rate of 5% associated with it.
For the
That-
whole time period.
And that doesn't change.
It does not change.
Yeah.
Okay.
Likewise, the investments. So Mishpakoten has an investment in their capital or principal account. That attracts 6% interest, and that doesn't change. But if they have another deposit into their account, and it's in period 2, it'll attract 4% interest until period 3 kicks in, and now it's 3.5%.
So is it fair to say if we just look at the first 3 bullet points, rates of interest were reduced over the years unless a specific interest rate had been attached to a specific deposit?
Right.
Thank you.
And of course, these rates only extend to 1909. The Indian Affairs Band Management Manual that.
Sorry, is that the manual for the administration of band monies?
That's correct.
What
That-
does it do?
It has a table it has a table at some point in the report, I could find it, that sets out what these rates of interest are and how they change. And the interest rate regime changes significantly in the post-World War II period. And I can't remember the ins and outs, but they're set by ordering council and it's a floating rate. So,
When you say ordering council, is that
sorry, federal government ordering council.
Thank you.
I'll mention one other thing that just, it helps to understand how these different rates functioned is that at the start of some of these ledgers, there's a rate table that is, that appears and first it's a handwritten and then it's a printed statement. And what it does is it lists all the accounts by number. And for each account, it says in the principal or capital sub-account, what rate applies to what amount of money. So if you look in the account 27, which is the Robinson Superior account, there's 3 columns, 6%, 5%, and 3%, say, and it'll show that $40,000 attracts 5% interest. And then it'll show that the 91,000 and change amount that was the second capitalization, it'll show that attracts interest at 3%. Then the next part of that interest rate table shows the interest sub-account, and it'll show what rates apply to what amounts of money. So it's so clearly, when you look at just a net balance in one of these accounts, you can't say that a single interest rate applied. And so the clerks in the department had to keep track of that and calculate what the appropriate rate was for the different amounts from year to year.
sounds like a tough job? Okay, so I think we're about the time that we typically take our morning break. I just have 3 slides left. It should not take long, although of course my estimate for this morning was off.
That's my fault.
What do you say, Helen? Let's go.
Okay. So could you speak to slide 44? Please.
Slide 44 addresses compounding of interest, and this is one of those instances where I thought I knew what the practice was, and it wasn't until I started digging into the accounts more that I learned that I was wrong. And compounding was generally the practice throughout this time period. The only time it didn't really apply was in the 1850s in those band-specific land fund and annuity accounts, because those cash balances were being, the interest from them was being transferred into the general fund. So effectively, you didn't have compounding, but within the general fund, you had compounding. So really, the department is just peeling off the interest there for their own uses. But as a
During that
Sorry.
period in the
1850s,
Was it peeling or stealing? I'm sorry.
peeling.
Peeling.
No, I
sorry.
wouldn't say stealing. That's
Okay, sorry, I
a little too-
misheard.
And that's the province of Canada's.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as a general rule, compounding of interest takes place.
And just so it's very clear for the record, I'll just ask you 2 questions. So was compounding of interest occurring in the RST treaty-wide account between July 1st, 1861 and March 31st, 1909?
Yes, it was.
And the obvious companion question, was compounding of interest occurring in the RST First Nation band specific accounts that existed in this time period between July 1st, 1861 and March 31st, 1909?
Yes, it was. Can I go back and correct the first answer I gave, though?
Yes,
So in
please.
the Robinson Superior Treaty-wide annuity account, I wasn't able to find clear evidence of compounding until I think 1866. That's not to say, it's very difficult to tell in this because I'm back calculating them, and if there isn't a balance that's carried over from one reporting period to the next, then you have no basis to make a calculation. So I can only say with certainty that compounding was happening as of 1866. But if I look in the Robinson Huron account, I can see that it was happening. So I think it's fair to presume that it was. It's just I don't have the evidence that I would normally rely on to make that statement.
So let's move on to the last part, the last 2 slides. We have part G of your slide, slide 45. And before you get into these 2 slides, when you're describing the content in these slides, are you speaking as a historian?
Yes, I am. And I can be very brief here because I went on for quite a while earlier in my testimony about this exact issue that I'm talking about here, which is the Crown control over First Nations funds. And my point in the report and on these slides is simply that there existed legislation that gave the Crown, in this case, the province of Canada, very considerable control over Indian monies, and that this continued on into the post-Confederation era under the federal government of Canada. There's a difference between what the law says and what is practiced, and that's what I described earlier, that discretion that existed in individual cases. There are really 2 ways to address this question, and neither of them was available to me when I wrote my report. The first one would be to do a comprehensive look at what the laws and regulations and policies are, and from that to argue a priori what the situation was. The other is a bottom-up or empirical approach where you look at evidence of what was actually happening with all these First Nations, and you go into the detailed archival records and the trust accounts. That's a very extensive piece of research, and I didn't do that either. So the only opinion I can offer, if it's of any value, is based on my experience working with First Nations records and trust accounts, and I've already described that.
Do you want to go through slide 45?
I can look at it. No, oh, do you want me to read it into the record?
Okay. Well, so what's the first piece of legislation
Sure.
on this subject?
Sure, of course. The first piece of legislation that I've found that addresses the management of Indian monies or First Nations monies was the 1860 Act respecting the management of the Indian lands and property. This was an act of the legislature of the province of Canada. I'll read the relevant section from that legislation. The governor and council, and that's the governor and council of the province of Canada, may, and there's an ellipse here, so I took out some words for some reason, presumably because they weren't that important, may direct how and in what manner and by whom the monies arising from sales of Indian lands and from the property held or to be held in trust for the Indians shall be invested from time to time, and how the payments to which the Indians may be entitled shall be made, and shall provide for the general management of such lands, monies, and property. So I'm not a lawyer, I don't interpret this, but in practical terms, it describes this, the situation generally, that the Crown has the responsibility for managing Indian monies. In practice, the situation is much more variable.
Okay, and could you speak to slide
Could I
46?
just ask
Oh,
this
sorry.
question? When you say the practice was variable,
Mhm.
but the bottom line was still it was the Crown, whether it was a sympathetic Indian agent or an unsympathetic Indian agent,
Correct.
the bottom line was
Yep.
it was Crown control.
Absolutely.
So when you say it varied considerably, how the Crown exercised control
Right, yeah,
varied. Is
you're
that a
right.
better way to put it?
Yeah, it is a better way of putting it. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to say it better.
No, I think that's very important to look at it that way. I agree.
Okay, thank you.
And if you could speak to slide 46.
So what I say here is that the actual language in that 1860 Act that I just read was substantially repeated in post-Confederation legislation passed by the Government of Canada. As I've already stated, that federal government control over First Nations monies persisted well into the 20th century. The practice of control over First Nations finances allowed for some variation. I've discussed that, but as you have pointed out, Your Honor, the fundamental picture is one of Crown control, and that what varied is how that was exercised. And then in 1950, there was some legislative reform with a major set of changes to the Indian Act, which included a loosening, as I would describe it as an historian, a loosening of those restrictions. Specifically, First Nations were allowed to control the revenue accounts, not the capital account, but the revenue account.
The revenue account is, you haven't used
The
that word.
interest, is
Interest,
the interest account,
yeah. So
the
they just call
interest
it
sub-account.
interest sub-account. Yes, they call it the revenue. It gets renamed the revenue account at some point. I can't remember when. Might have been 1950. Yeah.
Okay,
ahead.
so I think now is a good time for a break. I need to review my notes. I might have a question or two afterwards, but other than that, I'm almost done.
Thank you. Let's take the break.
All right, we'll recess for 15 minutes. Board members, maybe be seated.
I have no more direct examination questions.
Thank you very much.
Just before I start, I understand that Canada has no questions either.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you very much.
I understand you prefer to be called Mr. Angel as opposed to Dr. Angel. Is that okay?
That's fine.
Mr. Angel, my name is Harley Schachter. I'm a lawyer representing some of the First Nations in this case. And I have a couple questions I want to ask you, okay? So the first thing is just an observation about the state of the accounts. You would agree with me that your opinion and what you can conclude and advise the court about is dependent on how accurate the accounts are.
Yes, I would agree.
And you're aware, sir, I take it, of the numerous reports over the years that have been written about the problems with the way the accounts, we'll call them the trust accounts, have been kept?
I'm aware of many such reports, yes.
So, I mean, from as early as a fellow by the name of Jarvis, do you know him?
I know Mr. Jarvis, yes.
So Mr. Jarvis was in what, about the 1840s, was it?
1830s into the 1840s.
So in 1830s and 1840s, we have him not keeping records properly, correct?
That's correct, yes.
And that problem of inaccurate record keeping plagues an analysis of the Indian trust accounts for a long time. Is that fair?
No, I would say that it's endemic to the department and the bureaucracy in the 1830s and 40s. The last of those major commissions, I think, that you're referring to, the Bagot Commission, recommended substantial reforms, and a lot of reforms did take place in the late 1840s. And I would say that the record-keeping practices improved greatly by the 1850s. There are still problems, absolutely.
And still problems in the 1950s.
I don't know what you're referring to there. sir.
All right, well, perhaps we'll get to some of those
Okay.
problems. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about your qualifications.
Certainly.
Now, you've never written a peer-reviewed paper concerning the RST Anishinaabe, have you?
No, I haven't.
You've never written a peer review paper about any Anishinaabe First Nations, have you?
No,
You've never written a peer-reviewed paper in respect of any First Nations people, have you?
not as an historian. I have, in the context of my work in fisheries and resource management, yes.
Well, I was going to get to that.
Yeah.
Your expertise is in effect, your academic expertise is in respect of fisheries. Is that fair?
No, it's not. I did my undergraduate and master's training in Canadian history, and my PhD actually involved a good deal of historical work and research, but it was a multidisciplinary degree, I would.
Your master's in history was unrelated to Aboriginal treaties.
Aboriginal treaties, correct? Yes, that's
It was
right.
unrelated, I said.
Unrelated, yes, I agree.
Yes. So what was your master's in history about?
I wrote about the Winnipeg General Strike of 1919, so my training was on Canadian social and working class history.
Yes. And your PhD thesis was to meet the requirements for a degree of philosophy. Is that correct?
It was a PhD. Yeah, a doctor of philosophy. It's a regular PhD.
Right. And it was for the unmaking of the Skeena River salmon fisheries as a social ecological system,
That's
correct?
correct.
And your point is, I take it that within that report, you made some comments about Aboriginal fisheries. Is that what you know?
No, that report didn't involve, I worked very closely with the, a lot of Aboriginal fishermen up on the north coast of BC. So I'll try and be clear about this. So I did a lot of work in a contemporary sense with First Nations up in northern BC. That wasn't really of a historical nature, but at the same time, I did a lot of historical research around the fishery. that
In
didn't
British
tou-
Columbia?
In British Columbia, that didn't touch on First Nations terribly much in the PhD work. So there was historical work in the PhD work that did not involve First Nations to a great degree. And then there was contemporary ethnographic work with First Nations that did involve a lot of northern BC First Nations, Tsimshian primarily.
Not RST nations.
No, they certainly aren't. They're
All right.
Tsimshian.
Now, you have no academic credentials as an ethnohistorian?
Not strictly speaking, the training I got at the, so I had 3 fields in my PhD. So one was economics, fisheries economics. One was ecology, systems ecology, and the third one was ethnohistory, anthropology. So insofar as a PhD tests a person in those 3 fields or areas, and I did a comprehensive exams in those areas. I do have training and a lot of practical field experience, but I wouldn't call myself an anthropologist or an ethnohistorian. I'd call myself a social scientist,
All right.
if you want a more general term.
You don't have any academic credentials, excuse me, or experience in, sorry, I should rephrase that. You do not have any academic credentials as a historian studying imperial crown policy or crown policy in general.
No, that's quite correct. I'm what you would think of as a practitioner. I gained most of my, well, apart from courses that I took in my undergrad, and I was lucky enough to work with some very good historians, Jennifer Brown, who was one of the most prominent historians in the Métis First Nations history. So I worked with her. But apart from that, all of my experience is derived non-academically. It's from just practical experience of doing research. I did I did a couple forays into writing papers. I think in my CV, there's a paper I drafted on Podesha and the one of the Fort William nations, and I presented it at the Algonquian conference and at UC Berkeley. But to be honest, I don't care that much for the academic context. I was much more interested in the practical work I was doing. So you're absolutely right to say I don't have that academic training.
Thank you, sir. Your practical experience, you say, is in collecting documents from archives. Is that fair?
No, I would say it's quite a bit more than that.
Okay, it includes collecting documents from archives.
It
Is that
includes
fair?
that, certainly.
And you have done litigation support for governments in Canada?
Litigation for governments, yes. I'm just trying to think if I've done any for litigation work for First Nations. Just give me a moment, please.
Not the question I asked. but
Oh,
you
I
can
see.
answer it
Okay,
that
no,
way.
no, fair enough. Yeah, okay.
You can answer it that way. My first point was you've done litigations, your work you've done in the field is litigation support for governments.
In the field that I work in, you mean?
Yes.
Yes, yes, that's correct.
And my next question was going to be, and you haven't done any litigation support for First Nations.
Yeah, I don't think so. Just give me one moment. I have, oh, no, that's not true. Yeah, I did do a few cases there. I worked closely with the late Rhys Jones of Lofchick Jones in Winnipeg, and we did quite a bit of work together. Most of it was not litigation. I frankly don't really like litigation that much. I prefer other processes, but we did work on the Rosso River claim, which had to do with gambling. And I worked with Rhys and the nation there.
Sorry, is that in your CV?
No, because it's not a report. So my CV doesn't list all the projects I worked on. I've worked on about 200 projects probably over the years. And so I did a lot of the research and supported the work. My dad was actually the expert in that case, but I did a lot of the background research.
Is it fair to say, sir, that aside from your work with Rhys Jones in Manitoba on a gambling case, your other litigation support is for federal government or the Ontario government?
For litigation, that's correct, yes.
Can we go to page 95 of your report, exhibit 87? At page 95 of your report, under the heading of sources consulted, and you mentioned this in your direct evidence, you list the Joan Holmes Associates 2009 report, the management of Indian trust funds. Now, that's a 181-page report authored by Joan Holmes Associates, Inc. And you've read that report?
Yes, I have.
Now, in your report, Exhibit 87, I don't see one reference to Joan Holmes in your report,
Right.
but you relied on it for your opinion.
So perhaps there's a misunderstanding around how I put what I mean by sources consulted. So I read the entirety of the report. I took notes on sources that were in there. It was helpful in pointing me to certain documents and sources. So I went to those. Some of those ended up being included in the report. I'd have to think through it. So when I provide a list of sources consulted, as an historian, I'm thinking in terms of what are called secondary sources and primary sources. So the secondary sources are ones that I use to help me understand from another historian's perspective what the context is, or the sources that they use, or interpretation. So the John Leslie report's the same sort of thing. I don't cite it directly, I don't believe, but it was very helpful in understanding details there. So Joan Holmes, I most definitely used it, but I would cite the primary document that I learned about from that report rather than citing the Joan Holmes report. And actually in the first draft, the April 18th draft, there is a table from the Joan Holmes report in that draft, which I later dropped because I was able to improve on it. So then I didn't choose to keep it.
I'm going to suggest to you that what happened is that in your draft reports, you actually reference Joan Holmes.
Mhm.
Isn't that true?
That's what I just said, yes.
Yeah, well, not just the chart, but there's other portions of your report. You actually footnote her.
Oh, right, yes.
Yes. And what happened is that you were concerned that the Joan Holmes report was an internal document that was not publicly available. And you decided, after consulting with somebody, that you would not use the reference to the Joan Holmes report because it was an internal document.
No, that wasn't the case at all. So I think I touched on it, but my preference is always to cite the original sources. So when I provide a draft report, it's part of a progression. So I cited Joan Holmes because it's basically a shortcut. At the time I wrote that draft report, I'm going, what do I have to rely on? I'm just going to rely on Joan Holmes for the moment, knowing full well that I will in time replace that citation with a citation to the original document if I'm able to collect it. If there had been other topics in the Joan Holmes report that I felt necessary to cite in my final report, I would have done so. I wouldn't have hesitated to do so.
Now, Joan Holmes in her report has, as I am just reading it in her 181-page report, has over 500 footnotes. Did you look at the source documents in her report as well?
Oh, certainly not all of them, no, because a good portion of the report isn't relevant. No, I didn't look at every footnote or source document, sorry, no.
Where did you get the Joan Holmes report? If it's a confidential internal document?
It was emailed to me by, or it was provided by council
For Ontario.
for Ontario, yes, sorry.
When was it provided to you?
My memory is not great on that score. I think it was.
Perhaps I can help you. Is it before you did your first draft?
Oh, yes, it was before that.
And did it come with instructions on what to do with it?
Not at all. It
Just
was
showed
shared.
up in the mail?
Oh, no, not at all. Okay, so I'm not sure how much I'm able to share this, Your Honor, because these are correspondences between myself and counsel, but I can
You-
explain. the
you-
context.
You don't have to be the guardian of that. There will
Okay.
be an objection if there's a
Okay.
problem.
All right. So
You just answer the question if and when it comes to you, and we'll
Okay.
hear from Ontario.
thank you. So Ontario retained another research outfit to do research for this. And I didn't have anything to do with directing that research. Those researchers produced that Joan Holmes document, they obtained it. And then Council for Ontario forwarded it on to me and said, here's something that they found. And, that was it. There was no context or.
Sorry,
instruction.
but I'm looking for instructions from
Yeah,
Ontario
yeah. No, there
that you
were.
got prior to producing your first report,
Right.
right? And I observe that it can't be the instructions that you finally got, because the instructions you finally got are dated after your first draft report.
For sure.
So did you receive instructions at all?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought we were still talking about the Joan Holmes report.
Well, we got to there through the Joan Holmes report, but I'm just asking a question about instructions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, certainly. I can explain about the instructions. So the initial instructions were oral. And they came from senior counsel. And I wrote them down. And then it was a phone call early January or February of 2022. I'm just going by memory. We had many conversations back and forth.
When you say we, who's we?
Yeah, sorry, myself and council had many.
Council for Ontario?
For Ontario. I'm sorry. I realize I should be more.
Well, it's okay.
Be
Well,
careful.
I'll try and keep you on track.
Yeah, all right, good. Should I be facing you instead?
No, speak to the, please speak to the question.
Okay. So we went back and forth, and I'm sure you're familiar that this process of defining research questions is always an iterative one. I mean, I don't think I've ever worked a project where a client has had a list of questions that never change between the beginning and the end. I suppose it's possible, but I can't remember any like that. This one was probably no. So I can give you the first 4 questions that were shared with me by council. I remember them because they were so simple. They were, what are the trust accounts? How are they used? Who had access to them? And how were they funded? And that was quite useful to me because they were so simple that I kind of kept them in my head as just a reminder. So whenever I felt like I was potentially going off track and taking the research in directions that were not relevant, I would just remind myself, okay, this is what I was told to do. And then back and forth, we worked a lot more specific questions. So, these are general questions and that's helpful in so far as it goes. But as you've seen from the testimony I've given, a lot of the real questions that I needed to answer were incredibly picky. They're just very, very exacting questions around what interest rate at what time and so on. And so those kinds of questions emerged out of those discussions between myself and council. And then, and sometimes with the expert economists too, because they were driving some of the questions in terms of like clarification on this point or that point or whatever. So I couldn't tell you how often they were involved, but a number.
Well, let's, what do you mean? So part of your instructions were received from other experts. Is that what you mean?
No, the instructions weren't received from them. They posed questions to me that then I had to think about in light of those initial instructions I'd gotten, the oral ones. So
Did you report back to them?
no, I never reported to them. I always reported through council.
And so would you report to council, here's the answers that the other experts asked
Here's the answers.
to the questions the other
For sure,
experts
yeah, I
asked?
would definitely. So a question was posed to me through council. And then I would reply to it and say, here's a question to what so-and-so asked. Yes, I would do that.
Yeah, and so the experts that communicated with you, did they communicate with you directly then?
No, so the only communications that I had with the experts were in the context of phone calls or Zoom meetings that. we
I
might
would
have.
consider that a communication.
Yeah, no, I quite agree. Yeah, no, but I mean, that they didn't, like outside, but with the, with council present is what I mean.
Well, that's okay. And who are those experts? Do you remember their names?
Professors Broadway and Smart,
Just those two.
just those two, yeah.
While we're on the issue of experts, did you read or review the report of Booth and Kersner, that some of Canada's witnesses?
Yes, I read the Booth and Kersner report at one time. I just skimmed over it. I think I read whatever reports I was instructed to read by council. If council felt that there was something in a report that I needed to be aware of because it mentioned trust accounts, then I read it.
And you're familiar that Booth and Kersner in their report and in their work examined the spending patterns of the trust accounts for the bands?
I remember that. I don't remember any of the specifics.
Do you recall that they did a more thorough analysis of the spending patterns than you did?
Oh, absolutely. I do recall that, yes.
Just getting back to your instructions then, sir. So you've told us about oral exchanges and the iterative process, and I think I understand that. But what is the first documented instructions you received?
Mhm. Yeah, the first documented instructions were, what I did was I put into writing what I thought the core questions were. This would be shortly before my end of March, early April
Of what year?
of 2022. So I put into writing myself what I thought the questions were. So we had those 4 initial questions, and then there's the iterative process, the back and forth. And I crystallized those questions into what I thought. I tried to crystallize what I thought the questions had come to be as of late March or early April, because I was writing my report at that time. And I sent them back to council and said, how do these look as an expression of the questions that you're asking me to address? And if I remember right, they were fine with that draft. And so that's what I included with the draft. So that's why there's that phrasing in the draft that I can't remember how it goes exactly, but it's something, basically I'm saying I wrote the questions, right? That's what it looked. And it's true, I did. I drafted them and sent them to council to say, is this writing of the questions, is this appropriate? Does this make sense in terms of what I'm being asked to address?
All right. Well, we're going to go through that later.
Sure.
That iterative process, but you still, I don't know that you've answered my question. When was the first written instructions received?
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, I guess what I was trying to say, and perhaps I guess I'm wrong then. I was trying to say that at the point that council said that the written ones I'd sent were good to go, then I considered those my first written instructions. But if that's not the right way to think about it, then I guess it wouldn't be until the letter just before June 30th, I guess.
So the letter that's attached to your report is the first recording that you have of receiving instructions in writing from Ontario. Is that fair?
Well, I think we're just gonna have to differ on that. I considered when I sent written questions to council and I asked, are these the questions that I should be addressing in my report? And I received back an answer, yes, I considered those written instructions. I did.
Okay, so in your draft then, where we see a list of questions, the genesis of those questions is you?
The genesis is the conversations that we had back and forth, starting with the 4 questions put by senior counsel, and then the actual writing of the questions is absolutely me.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so if we see questions in your reports, both the one that's filed or in the draft reports, that those questions were generated through requests by legal counsel and in discussion with you?
Sorry, I didn't follow that one. Can you explain again?
Well, where there's a list of questions in your report,
Okay,
that is a result of discussions you had with legal counsel, and those are your instructions.
Oh, okay, yes. Sorry, I was thinking of other questions because there's so many other questions in the report, but you mean the ones that that are in the introduction in there?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, yeah, for sure.
And in the same thing is in the draft. There was a list of questions in the draft, and that was the instructions you had received at the time from Ontario.
Right.
Thank you. Perhaps I can turn to the Joan Holmes report, and there is some things here that I wonder if you agree with. So at page 8 of Joan Holmes' report, now this is not a document that is in your, that although you cited it, you didn't include it in the documents you produced for Ontario.
So I didn't cite it. I put it in what's what you might also call a bibliography. So there is a distinction between citations and the bibliography. So those other sources, like I have record group 10 in there. I don't include all of record group 10. So.
Would you agree with this? The Indian Act 1876 provided for the management of Indian monies under clauses 58 through 60. Precursors to the act, however, provided little guidance for their management. Would you agree with that?
We just have that on the screen. I'm just going to look at the Indian Act clauses 58 through 60, if I may.
Sure, of course.
Yeah. So I don't have the full text of the Indian Act in my report here for those sections, but what I'm seeing here from what I wrote is that the language in the 1860 Act is largely repeated. There's an additional section added in 1868 regarding payment to the Receiver General of proceeds from Indian land sales and timber sales. And then the Indian Act made only minor changes to wording. So I wouldn't agree with that sentence in the Joan Holmes. No, I wouldn't, because I don't think there's not a lot of difference between the 1876 Indian Act and the 1860 legislation. So no, I wouldn't agree with that statement.
All right, let's go on to the next thing she says in the next paragraph.
Sure.
Statutory and or regulatory requirements regarding Indians, their lands and other assets prior to Confederation, though numerous, give little direction regarding the management of Indian funds. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, let me just look at this for a moment. Okay, statutory. Right, I was going to say, I wasn't sure because you have a lot in orders in council, but then the report goes on to reference that. So yes, I would agree with that sentence. Yes.
Thank you, sir. At page 24, Joan Holmes makes the following observation at footnote 61. John F. Leslie, Commissions of Inquiry into Indian Affairs into the Canadas, 1828 to 1858, evolving a corporate memory for the Indian Department, Treaties and Historical Research Center, INAC, February 1985, 86-87, period. Note, John Leslie's report is an in-depth study of the commissions of inquiry and their impact on the evolution of the Indian Department as a whole. the Indian Department expenses, including the cost of presence, comma, annuities, comma, and the management of the department was a focus of the commissions, period. Thus, the reports of the commissions and the various secondary sources which examine them are integral to the study of the management of the Indian trust funds.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely.
Could I have the, go up one screen, please? Thank you. Thank you.
And we can find all of those reports listed, I understand it, at footnote 3 of page 8 of Joan Holmes' report. And I'm just going to list them, and I understand them. I'm reading from footnote 3 from Joan Holmes' report. There's general Darlene's report of 1828. That's one of them.
Yes,
The second one is the Macaulay report from 1839.
yes,
And then there's the 1840 Public Department Inquiry Report.
yes.
Is that called the Macaulay and Hepburn Report, or is that, you don't know?
Right, that's committee number 4.
Yes.
Yeah.
Then there's the 1844 Bagot Commission Report.
Right,
Then there's the 1855 Superintendent General Burry's Report.
right, yes,
And the final report is the 1858 Pennyfather Report.
correct.
So those are the reports that Joan Helms says are important to review and understand.
By extension, because they're the commissions. Yes, right. No, those are very critical sources for understanding the Indian trust accounts. I would agree.
Now, your report doesn't review or consider those reports, does it?
No, no, the only relevant report that would relate to this would be another John Leslie report on the Pennyfather Commission, but and the Pennyfather report, that report by Leslie covers that Bury report as well as another piece by Oliphant and then the actual Pennyfather Commission. So, and I've read the Pennyfather report innumerable times. I didn't look at those earlier reports. I'm familiar with all of them and I've read them many times, but I didn't look at them because the time period I was focused on was from 1850 forward. And I was not looking at the history of the trust accounts in the period leading up to 1850 because it's very, well, frankly, because the period I was looking at started in 1850. But I thoroughly agree that many of the most critical things that happen in terms of establishing the Indian trust accounts occurred during the 1840s. And there's a very voluminous record that you've referred to there that deals with that.
Can I just get some clarification? I didn't look at them. Was that all of the ones listed by Mr. Schachter?
Right. I did look at no, that's correct. I didn't look directly at any of those reports for this research. No, I've read all of them many times, but for this research, I didn't read any of them.
Thank
No.
you.
Let's turn then for a moment to the monies held by the government with which to pay the Robinson Superior Treaty annuities. Now, would you agree with me, sir, that the monies held with which by the Crown with which to pay the annuities is a different pot of money than the annuities themselves? And maybe I'll try and clarify the question this way.
Yeah.
The annuities are are the payments made to the First Nations people. It's not the money that the governments use to pay the annuities.
I think I was understanding better the first time round.
Okay, well,
Sure.
maybe, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, why
Well, let
don't
me
I?
see if
and then-
I got your question. The annuities are payments
Yes,
to the First Nations, but they are not,
they are not the monies that the government has to use to pay the annuities.
so they're not, could I use the word source, but they're not the source of the annuities? Is that-
Maybe we can try and deal with it that way. Source is a better word.
Okay, the annuities are the payments.
Yeah, the annuities are the payments, not the source.
Huh. Can I try and answer that in a roundabout way? And I want to get back to the
Any way that's
question.
responsive.
All right. So here's my understanding of the way annuities relate to sources. And this predates the Robinson Treaty, is the expectation in the government was that revenues from sales of land would be used to fund the payment of annuities. That wasn't the case initially because you didn't have sales of land, and that expectation was often disappointed. There wasn't enough from that, but you see some correspondence, and I'm talking about documents that I just know of, but that aren't part of my report. I can remember correspondence where there's references to, the territorial revenue. So that's all of the money that's coming into the province of Canada's coffers from land sales and probably customs and that kind of so on, but certainly from land sales. There's references to, okay, the Commissioner of Crown Lands needs to transfer the value of the annuities from the territorial revenue over to the Receiver General so that the Receiver General can then authorize the payment of annuities to individual nations. Now, what I'm just describing right there, that's not the process that always held true. I just remember that from in the 1840s, there was a period of time when that was, I just remember it because it stood out in my mind that they referenced the territorial revenue, and the instruction was to the Commissioner of Crown Lands who had charge of that. So the source is, you have these lands that have been surrendered by nations in an agreement with the Crown.
Yes.
They generate revenues, and those revenues are expected to be sufficient to pay the annuities. So I conceptually, I've just applied the same model to the Robinson treaties, except that in the case of the Robinson treaties, of course, the legislature has to approve the expenditure of monies to pay for those annuities.
Until they're capitalized, and then it's sort of, don't need a vote of the
Right.
legislature after they've been capitalized.
Right, for that portion of them.
For that portion of it, fair enough.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to get at a question as to, or trying to get an answer as to when, if at all, does the monies, can I call it earmarked to
Sure.
pay the annuities? When does the money that's earmarked to pay the annuities get impressed with some sort of trust, if at all?
Okay, yeah.
There's Mr. Lipton's on his feet.
My objection is it calls for a legal. Mr. Angel isn't a lawyer. He doesn't know.
Unless there's words that say something is impressed with a trust, unless he's read that.
Sure, I just don't want his answer to be taken as a statement of law.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy. That actually is exactly what I was going to say. I have not read anything that says that there's a trust created with respect to that. It's an interesting point, and I've thought about it for sure. I don't know at what point that is created, but yeah, I've never read any historical documents that.
But
state that. And we're talking about the Robinson.
Yeah, we're
Treaties
talking about
here.
the Robinson treaties, and I'm trying to get an understanding from you about when, if it's supposed to be coming from the territorial revenues,
Right.
we've established that.
Mhm.
Is it at some point in your historical analysis, as a historian,
Mhm.
Is it somehow earmarked and at some point, some fund is set aside and earmarked as being held for the First Nations?
Sure.
That's all I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
I don't need a legal trust definition.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. No, I know exactly the point you're making. It, at least I think I do now. And it's an interesting one, and I puzzled over it, is they didn't park a bunch of money and say, we're gonna use this. It was just from year to year, they approve the spending of this money, and it comes out of the consolidated revenue fund. So, yeah, I'm not gonna comment on whether or not there's some quality of a trust around that. I have no idea, but I think I understand the point you're making is they don't earmark. It's not like the capitalization. It's not like there's something where they've got that amount of money sitting there and they say, we got to protect this because it's going to be used to pay the annuities.
Right, and to be fair, I think you would agree that these accounts, the annuities account, the treaty-wide annuity account, let's use that as an example, it's really a notional account. It's not like there's actual money in there. It's all in the consolidated revenue
Yeah.
account.
I would agree. I think the notional account, I think that's correct way to describe that account, except insofar as when you have monies sitting in it from one reporting period to the next, it's more than just notional. Do you know what I mean? Like so say not all of the treaty monies get distributed. and
It's
so-
still an accounting entry only, wouldn't you agree?
I'm not an accountant. I know what you're getting at, and
But,
yeah.
sorry, didn't you say that?
didn't I say what?
It's an accounting mechanism?
Oh,
Only?
absolutely. I said, yeah.
Sorry, so if you just go back to that, I don't want to, it's just I don't want to confuse myself.
Right. No, all accounts are notional to some degree, right? They're a container into which you put certain transactions that are related for some reason.
Well, you record certain transactions. You don't put,
Fair enough. You record, no,
transactions.
absolutely. I agree. You record certain transactions. So I guess in one sense, all accounts are notional. I'm thinking they're not, but they're tied to something that's actual. They're tied to actual money somewhere. That money sits somewhere in a bank. You're really testing my ability to think through this in a consistent manner. And again, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I suspect that there's accounting principles at work here that because I'm not an accountant, I'm not thinking about it in the way that an accountant would. But
I'm only
let me
asking you
ju-
to
let me
think
just
about
try
it
one
as
of-
a historian.
But yeah, let me try. Yeah, exactly. As an historian, let me just think about it another way. So the Crown, this is me just thinking about this. The Crown has an obligation. They know that they have a very solemn obligation to make sure that these annuities are paid every year. And they need to keep track of their finances with respect to that obligation. And the treaty-wide annuity account is the mechanism they use in order to keep track of making sure that from each year, from one year to the next, that money comes in to that account and then it goes out again properly. It's a bookkeeping device for satisfying that treaty obligation to pay annuities. That's the best I can come up
Okay.
with. Okay.
Now, you would agree with me that once the annuity monies are in the hands of the beneficiaries, those monies could not be Indian monies.
Not Indian monies in the sense of the legislation.
Correct.
Right, yes, I would agree. Yeah, I suspect as it passes from the agent to the, well, yes.
Could I just go back to Mr. Schachter to your
Yes.
question, which I'm sorry if I interrupted and it interrupted your thought, but given what you have said, are you making a distinction between a ledger, which you have called these records, which is a place to record
Right.
transactions, and a bank book, which reflects what is in an account.
Hmm. Just give me a moment.
And
please.
I'm talking about a very simple bank book,
Yeah,
like the old days bank book.
there is a distinction there, for sure. So the bank book records actual value or cash in terms of where it's held
Mhm.
and transactions related to that. A public account is a way of organizing a portion of that cash around a certain application or purpose.
Mhm.
So it might be that a portion of the money is held in cash in the Bank of Upper Canada relate to the Fort William First Nation. So there's a bank account that holds lots and lots of money. There are records that relate to that. Then there's an accounting system that says out of all of that cash that's held in a bank account or bank accounts, a portion of it belongs to the or is managed on behalf of the Fort William First Nation. So yes, there is a distinction there.
Thank you.
Well, let's turn to your slide 45 to sort of just continue with this thought.
Okay.
Your slide 45 was about control over First Nations, and you quoted from the 1860 Act. And this is, and I just want to read from it, from your slide 45. The governor and council may direct how and in what manner and by whom the money arising from sales of Indian lands and from the property held or to be held in trust for the Indians. So there's the word trust, and you understand colloquially what that means?
Mhm. I do.
Yes. Shall be invested from time to time. So what we have here under the 1860 Act is a recognition that whether you call it a bank account with money in it, or whether you call it a notional account, the government is recognizing that these funds are to be invested by them on behalf of the First Nation who's has an interest in the fund. Is that
Yes.
right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you would agree with me that this legislation is recognizing and really codifying earlier thoughts by the Crown that they have an obligation to look after this money. Is that fair?
Absolutely, yes.
And when they have an obligation to look after it, what the Crown is thinking is that they're going to do their best to invest, to use the words from slide 45 and the 1860 Act, they will use their best efforts to invest it in its best possible way for the First Nation.
I agreed with everything up to, well, I don't know, best possible way. I mean, it's a trust, it's in trust. They have an obligation, in my colloquial understanding of it. They have an obligation to manage it responsibly. So,
Right.
yeah, best possible way. So,
To do their best for the First Nation.
yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, that's good.
And would you agree with me, or maybe you can't tell from your historical knowledge, that depending on how much money it is, you'll have a different answer about how to invest it?
Right, right. So you mean if it's just a small sum, you would invest it in a different way than?
Oh, you
or-
might.
Or a large sum?
Yeah. Does your historical research tell you that the amount of money has
Yeah, has it
has an
bearing?
effect on how the money's invested?
Sure, let me think about that for a moment. No, it's a very interesting question. Perhaps this isn't a direct answer, but I'll try this, is that there's definitely concern on the part of Indian Department officials that they achieve a good rate of return on the investments. You know, that comes through very clearly in the correspondence. I don't think they make a distinction in terms of the amount of money. I mean, if it's £1,000 or £5,000, I don't think they would still have sought out, the best rate of return relative to risk that they could. Yeah, so I'll answer your question directly. I don't think that the amount of money influenced the choice of investment.
But you only looked at amounts from 1850 onwards, is that right?
For this, yeah, absolutely, yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And the amounts in 1850 onwards for RST there's not a large surplus there, is there?
Well, the only nation that has anything to work with initially is Mishpacholtan, and it's very small. It's
Yes.
250 pounds.
Would you agree with me that for the period 1851 to 1854, the RHT annuity monies of £600 were not distributed to individuals, but were distributed to bands on requisitions by their chiefs?
I'm afraid I can't remember. I haven't looked at that historical record in a long time. I don't remember.
It is 5 minutes to 1. That would be a good time to break.
Thank you.
I am making good progress, and I think we'll be done today.
Very good.
So we should break.
So it's 2:15. Suit everyone. Thank you.
For recess